It's not the instrument that really matters here. In fact, these are vessels for divine light, which is based on Joseph being righteous. And I don't think we should be bothered whether it happens in a book, in a brass mirror, in a stone of whatever shape, size, or color.
I am joined today by Alan Hansen. He was born and raised in Israel. He is married with one daughter, and he is obsessed with books. And today, we are going to be talking about some fascinating stories I am so excited to talk about. So, first of all, Alan, can you explain what the rabbinical literature is and extra-biblical Jewish traditions are, where they came from?
Sure. So just a real quick recap. The main books that you have after the Bible, the end of the Second Temple era, with the rabbinic tradition, you have the written Torah, which is the scriptures, especially the 5 books of Moses, and then you have the oral traditions, which pretty much is everything else. And in the 2nd century AD, they start to write down and codify some of the laws and a little bit more in depth in how you're supposed to observe things. Now, after that, that's called the Mishnah. And after that was written, you then have, and this is a process that took centuries and happened in land of Israel and in Babylon at the same time, but you end up with something called the Talmud, which is basically a stylized literary representation of how they discuss things in the academies. And these can be pretty freewheeling. They wander off a lot from the main topic that with the Mishnah they were talking about. And alongside with this, the Talmuds contain several, and there's independent collections. There's something called Midrash, which is basically different stories and explanations about the scriptures. A lot of these incorporate earlier traditions. We have some that are definitely can be dated back to the Bible that carry on all the way into the modern era in different guises. But the main factor here is that the rabbinic sages were very close readers of the Bible. They were attuned to repetitions, doublets, different grammar things. And when they noticed something odd, they thought that there's going to be something more about it. They went into it. But a lot of the traditions predate these. They preserve a lot of earlier stuff and it's hard to tell sometimes when one begins, one ends.
Okay, that is so fascinating. So how does that tie in to seer stones?
All right. So this is something where we need to go back a little bit further. Before the rabbinic era, we know in the Bible, we're all familiar with the 2 creation accounts. But there's other things in the Psalms and Isaiah sometimes, hints of other creation stories, such as a creation by light. One of the big things is, in Genesis, God says, let there be light, but this is before the sun and the moon and the stars. So they were thinking that this must have been God's divine light, the primordial light by which he created. In the Psalms, it says, wraps himself with a mantle of light. Mm-hmm. And
speaking about that, I have heard there is some kind of a tradition about Adam and Eve being clothed in garments of light as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there are different things. Light is basically the material that God's made from and all sustains the universe with. So there's a lot into that. But we know, as far as the earliest Greek commentators in scripture that we have several centuries BC, we know they talk about the light also. So Aristobulus wrote that the first day, the one in which light was born, by which all things are seen together. Okay. And this is the biggest part and what connects to the seer stones. So this tradition is very strong, and it's present in most every text that has something to do with this. But the idea was that this light was so powerful that Adam, and some scholars even say you can read it just as all men in this case, could see from one end of the earth to the other, one end of the world to the other.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah, you could see all things with it. And God saw that the wicked in the generation of Noah and others would abuse that. So he decided to hide that light.
Okay.
Once Adam was expelled from the garden, he decided to hide the light. And when he did, there's some really interesting traditions about where he hides it. Sometimes it's in the rocks, sometimes it's in the ground, things that let things grow.
Mm-hmm.
And he also was supposed to have hidden it in his scriptures.
Oh.
So these are two things, the rocks and the scriptures, that are big vessels for divine light.
All right. So I think that ties in a little bit with one of the stories that we wanted to talk about Adam and the angel Raziel.
Yeah.
So can you just give us, first of all, just an overview of what that story is and how that light ties into that?
Oh, yeah. So we have this angel who's called Raziel, which means the secrets or mysteries of God. And he appears in several old sources. And the idea is he's the keeper of the secret information. And when Adam, before he was expelled from the garden, had a book that he could read in, according to some traditions. They interpret the verse, these are the generations of Adam, as meaning this was a book that he could see what was in it from the beginning of the world to the end. And the book was full of light, and it was connected to the tree of knowledge.
Okay.
Then when he's expelled from the garden, and he starts to weep, in many of the traditions, I'm just giving the general because there's several of them, but the main line is that he's weeping and despairing because he doesn't have that knowledge, that connection anymore. So God restores it to him through the angel Raziel.
Okay. How does he restore it to him?
Sometimes he just shows up and gives him a book. Okay. Now, this story carries on to talk about Noah. And the wording is not entirely clear, whether it's the angel showing up and giving it to Noah brand new or if it was handed down. There's a little bit of traditions back and forth, and some other traditions have the book being given to Seth. Mm-hmm. But the really interesting thing is Noah gets it, and it tells him how to build the ark.
Oh, okay.
And he builds this box of gold that he puts it in. And then he knows, he uses it to tell when it's daytime, when it's nighttime, when he can feed the animals and all the other wisdom. But the really interesting thing about this book, and this is a tradition in the reconstructed Book of Secrets or Sefer Razim, which is a whole bunch of lists of how you use angels to do what you want. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is that this book was engraved on a stone. Oh. So it's both a glowing stone and a book at the same time.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And it implies that it glows also when he knows when it's day and night and being able to see from it. So that's the implication. So you have this book in a gold box. That's a book made out of a stone. And the stone is a sapphire stone, which has a lot of cosmic significance.
Okay, that was another thing I wanted to ask about was sapphire stones, because I think it was Exodus says that there's this vision of Jehovah where the ground under his feet is paved with sapphire, and in Ezekiel the throne of God is supposed to be made out of sapphire. And I've heard that in some of these legends, the 10 Commandments were written on sapphire stones, and that like the foundations of New Jerusalem are supposed to be built out of sapphire, and something about heavens glowing with the light of sapphire or something. So I'm really rusty on all the details, but what is the deal with sapphires?
Okay. So sapphire, as we know it, is blue.
Yes.
But anciently, including the Greek word sapphairos and the Hebrew saphir, we're probably not talking about sapphire as much. We're about lapis lazuli, which is a little bit deeper blue, and it's also specked with gold pyrite.
Okay.
So it looks like the heavens with stars and celestial bodies.
Oh.
And the ancient symbolisms that represents the cosmos and the heavens where God is. The Egyptian scarabs, they've got the gold for the sun, and they've got the lapis lazuli to represent the skies and the heavens. Some of the Assyrian accounts have God sitting on a throne of sapphire. So there's the tradition with Moses and having the tablets is the same thing. It's a representation of its divine nature. So God inscribes it on that, and then when Moses breaks them, he replaces them with his own sapphire because according to tradition, he was rich and had it.
Okay.
Later on, in the Middle Ages, you have this tradition where he replaced them with regular stone because they were a lesser law, but that's not the earlier ones. And when rabbinic tradition says precisely that sapphire is like the ocean, like the heavens, like the throne of God, and like God. So that's why they use that.
Wow.
So it's a really important stone for all those. And on the breastplate of the priest, they also had, the tribe of Issachar had a sapphire stone, which would be blue. And Rabbi Bachai, in Spanish exegete in the 13th century, wrote in his commentary that blue is a very humble spiritual color, because it's not bold like red or anything. So the light there is also light of wisdom. And it's a light that shines and is equal to the light that shines from the scriptures.
Oh, that's really fascinating, actually.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
And it was also connected with being able to, in Middle Ages, being able to heal eye ailments and bad eyesight. They'd pass it over.
Okay.
So he uses that also to explain that it's equivalent to being healed spiritually by scriptures. It's symbolizing that.
Oh, that is so cool.
So yeah, the stones had a lot of significance that kind of faded out, but meant a lot for people back then.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. Okay, so you mentioned Noah having this glowing stone or book in this gold box. So how does that relate to the verse in Genesis 6:16, where it talks about the windows, that the footnote in our current version of the Bible? It's a shosar. Is that how you?
Soha.
Soha. Okay.
Soha. Yeah, Soha is something that we don't really know what it is. That's the only place where it appears.
Okay.
But it could be a window, which is meant to bring in light. But it also is connected to the word for midday, which is also windows when the sun is shining brightest. So it's etymologically related to the word for radiance, Zoha. So there's a lot of connection with the light. So you had not just the Azim, but other books say that there was a glowing stone in there. And that's when Noah knew how to feed the animals according to their schedule and habits.
Oh, that's so interesting. So you said that that might have been passed down through Seth and through other. So are there other stories through all of these Jewish traditions of some of the old Bible patriarchs and prophets having glowing stones?
There are, and some traditions have it be the same stone. So, for example, Noah's stone book is passed down then from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to Samuel, and so on, down to prophets and wise men, all the way through Solomon, then had other books, but this one is the one he liked best, they say.
So that's maybe what gave Solomon his wisdom?
Part of it. Solomon's got wisdom from all sorts of different sources, according to his legends. But the thing is, this stone, in some traditions, it's the same. In other traditions, these are different stones. So it's not always the same. Now, there's a really popular book, which is a fantastic resource, Howard Schwartz's Tree of Souls, where he connects them all together from Adam to Noah down through Joseph.
Oh, okay.
But the actual source material, it's not as explicit. He's filling it. He sees himself as part of the same tradition.
Okay.
So he connects the dots. It's not always explicit in the text. So there you have it. There's different ways of looking at it.
Okay. All right. So in the book of Abraham, like we read about Abraham's Urim and Thummim. So is that kind of the same type of glowing stone that we were talking about as far as the traditions say?
Right. In some traditions, it's the same one that's passed down. Some of them, they're unique to him. Mm-hmm. But there's one where he had a stone and he was able to see through it, fill with light, but also it was able to heal people.
I've heard that.
And this is the same thing, like I mentioned earlier, lapis lazuli had healing treatments. This was considered a very legitimate part of religion. Mm-hmm. In Spain, King Alfonso X the Wise, in fact, gathered several Jewish and Muslim sages to translate and compose a book for him about the stones and their properties and how it all connects there. But yeah, with this healing stone, remember, people didn't have easy access to reliable medicine. God hangs it on the sun when Abraham dies. So it doesn't go down to the others in that tradition.
Okay.
But there's a different tradition where Abraham passes his own stone down to Isaac.
Okay. So what happens after Isaac gets it? Does anybody know?
Yeah. So let me first share. This is one that I've only recently read and I don't think's ever been brought up.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So there's another late 13th century Spanish work of Kabbalah, which is one of the mystical traditions later on. But they've got a bunch of discussion about Abraham and Isaac. There's a verse about the sons of the concubines, Abraham's other wives, getting some gifts, by Isaac getting everything.
Oh.
And this everything is supposed to be Abraham's glowing stone. And he gives it to Isaac as a reward for enduring through all the terrors of nearly being sacrificed. He tells him, I'm giving you this stone because I know that when you have Esau, he's going to spend all your money and waste all your resources. So you can use this stone to find other precious stones and wealth.
Oh.
So that's really interesting, especially when you think about later on Joseph Smith's early career.
Yeah.
And here, so we see that there's not a lot of condemnation. In fact, there isn't any. There are legitimate uses for it.
Okay, that kind of reminds me of the story of Jacob with his rod of poplars, where he was like touching the calves, and they were. Yeah. So he was using that for a secular thing too, in order to gain wealth and to be able to provide for his family and everything. So that is very interesting.
Yeah, and Abraham in that text specifically talks about how this is stone with the divine light that helped create all things.
That is very cool.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of things, and then there's traditions about Jacob with it. Jacob's a whole nother thing with his close association with the sun, which we see all the patriarchs are connected to the sun, and the sun's also connected to finding jewels and metal and gold and things. There's a whole lot in that. But I do want to go a little bit more about the divine light.
Yes, please.
Because this tradition, God hides it. So the wicked can't use it. One strand of the tradition says it's hidden for the righteous for the future world to come, which means that it's not available until the end of days. But there's so many others talking about how you can use it all the time. Rabbi Azrael of Gerona says that it was hidden for the righteous for the future. Not the future world to come, but for the future when they need to use it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's the light of prophecy, because you can see what's going to happen from one end of the world to the other, from beginning and back of time. And it's this divine light that is fused, it's hidden. It's usually believed to be hidden either in certain objects like mirrors or speculum or jewels, or it's hidden in books.
That's so interesting.
And there's this really lovely tradition, and I'll paraphrase what Martin Buber wrote about later. He says, So you've got this light that was hidden for the righteous. And where was it hidden? In the Torah and the scriptures. So when people are studying it, aren't they going to find some of that light? They certainly will. And then what will happen with it? They'll show it through their deeds.
So it's basically the light of Christ.
It's a good way to look at it. And we can talk a little bit about the brother Jared with this.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting when brother Jared goes to get those rocks and he's thinking his own initiative. He's thinking back to the story of Noah, likely, who had the same situation. He would have been in darkness, windows not practical. Where do you get the light? So he goes up to the mountain, he carves out the stones. And you figure if we're looking at a part of the world where Jaredites were, that could very well be where they also hewed out sapphires. It doesn't say anything about that, but I figure that's an interesting possibility to think out. But he takes out the rock. Christ blesses it with brother Jared's faith. He's able to see more. And then with that light, both in Ether 3 and Ether 12, it talks about how Ether is able to see all the things in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
It's tapping into that same tradition.
That is so cool.
So it's something that's pretty ancient, and we can see it in our scriptures also. And we have Doctrine and Covenants 88, God creating everything out of the light and retracting it and bringing it back. We have the idea of the light of Christ, which is more than just our conscience.
Yeah.
That's a misreading I see a lot of times. It's certainly part of it, but it's a lot more powerful. Yeah,
I was going to say, I think it's Abraham where he's talking about organizing the world and how it's like powered by the light of Christ is like part of like what makes the universe work. So I don't remember exactly the connection I was making on that. But I made that connection somewhere as I was reading through all these chains of things about how, it's not just conscience, like you were saying. It like gives power to everything in the world and everything in the
Doctrine and
universe.
Covenants 88 talks about that a lot.
Yes.
Which is really, it's not been looked at enough in this kind of context, but when you do, it's got so many interesting things about it.
Yeah, that I think that's fascinating.
So we should, I think it's one of the funnest things you can look at in the scriptures. But the whole thing is the light lets you see, and it's a light of prophecy. And we have a much later 18th century tradition about the founder of the Hasidic music, Rabbi Yisrael Bar Shem Tov, and someone's cattle went missing. So he goes to find them. He pulls it up and he tells the guy, "Hey, I know where your cattle are. I found it written in the Zohar," and which is primary text of Jewish mysticism and esoteric. And the guy says, "Does he really say that exact scripture in there?" He says, "No, but it's filled with the light. And I was able to see where your cattle are." In the same opportunity, I saw something that was going on in the Jewish community of Amsterdam. And they were both in the territory of Ukraine. His nephew says that he saw what was happening with his brother-in-law in the land of Israel, also on a separate occasion.
So that is like Joseph Smith finding like the needle in the haystack, or the where he saw David Whitmer coming to visit him before.
Yeah, so we have this divine light being used to find cattle that went missing.
That is so interesting, the way it all ties together like that.
And it was through a book. In this case, the instrument is a book. In other cases, it's a stone.
Oh, that is so cool. And like the Book of Mormon is kind of both. I mean, it was in the stone box, and it was pulled out of the earth like a stone would be, but it's a book.
Right. And you've got a lot of that. The instrument is less important than what is actually happening, which is use of that divine light by the righteous.
That is so cool. So there was something that you were saying about the brother of Jared drawing on that old tradition, because he was in kind of the same situation. Now, I am really not very deep into the details of all of this, but I have heard stories of the story of Jonah.
Oh, yeah.
I love this, where like the fish that was prepared for him, in some versions, the eyes were like glowing orbs that he could see out into the ocean floor.
Mm.
And in some of them, he had glowing stones inside the fish that gave light to him that he could look into, and then he could see like the mysteries of God.
Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit about how that might tie into all of this? And like, I know the story of Jonah is often seen as more allegorical than literal, but do you know how that would tie into things?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, the ancient sages generally saw Jonah himself as a historical person.
Okay.
And there's no reason why he shouldn't be. I mean, it makes as much sense as him being invented, in fact, more.
Okay.
The narrative itself might be one of these cases where we've got a lot of embellishment, and it's there to serve a certain purpose. It's not a documentary story. But be that as it may, later on, for example, there's a famous commentary in the 18th century where Jonah is a symbol of the soul's descent into hell and coming back.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the topic of hell is in there when he's swallowed by the fish. It's not where we think about Jonah and the fishes, but it's less that, and it's more that hell was in the bottom of the ocean in ancient concepts a lot of times.
And so that's kind of like after Christ's crucifixion, him going into the spirit world for 3 days and then coming back out.
Yes, and in fact, Christ says that he gives him the sign of Jonah. There was an old messianic tradition about Jonah being either the Messiah or the precursor, and this plays into this story about the stones. Okay, so in this, Jonah thinks that God only has power over the earth, and he doesn't want to be shown up again, so he runs into his ship. There's a storm. Some of these stories are really funny. The sailors, they're wonderful people. They don't want to kill Jonah. They put him, he says, do it anyway. So they put him a little bit into the water, put his feet in, the storm calms down a little. They put him back in the boat, it starts up again until they finally throw him all the way in, and it's done. And he's swallowed by a fish. Some versions of the story, he's swallowed first by a male fish, which is very roomy and light and bright, but he forgets to pray. So God says, I made him a nice fish, and this is what he does. So he has him swallowed by a female fish with a whole bunch of eggs inside, and so it's stinky and crowded, and he remembers to pray. But the main one that we're going to talk about, the earlier tradition, is early Byzantine, probably by date. And there's a couple of these, but he's thrown into the water, he's swallowed by the fish. Now, both ideas of the eyes glowing, or of there being a precious stone suspended there, they're both in the same story. One has one opinion, they have the other. But it starts out by saying that it was as if Jonah walked into the great synagogue. This is important because synagogues and churches were big buildings without a lot of light.
Oh.
You had to hang lamps throughout it. And one of the righteous things people could do out of piety was to help donate money to build a lamp. And we have a description of St. Paulinus of Nola talking about the church that he built up and how it was all blazing from the lamps. And it's a really amazing description there. And this is what it's getting at, that inside the fish, it was so bright. It's as if you walked into the brightest buildings they used in the ancient worlds, because it hangs so many lamps.
Yeah.
So some say the eyes, some say there was a stone there. Mm-hmm. And he's able to see with that stone, with that light, it's radiating the divine light. And the fish tells him, Jonah, today I'm going to be swallowed by Leviathan. So Jonah says, okay, I'm going to save you. They go down. He scares away Leviathan by saying that in the future to come, he's going to fish him out and carve him up for the righteous for their feast. And he says to the fish, now show me around the wonders of the ocean. And they use either the eyes or the stone to go and see that. And they end up under the temple and its foundation stone. And this is where Jonah prays to God, if you save me from the fish, I promise that I will do what I vowed and come back and fish out Leviathan at the end of days. So because what we're talking about here is that God prepares these stones or this light, no matter the instrument he uses, for the righteous to accomplish his purposes.
That is very interesting. I've never heard that about going up under the temple stones like that. That is very cool.
They use the different verses in Jonah's psalm to talk about different stages in his journey.
Okay. That is very cool. So do you have any of these other connections that we haven't talked about yet? Any of these other stories that might fit into this theme?
Leviathan is one of these ancient traditions I mentioned earlier that survives. Because we know that the earliest ancient Near Eastern myths, and we have this in the Bible, are about God vanquishing the monsters of chaos and banishing him to the ocean and other parts while he creates the land and puts order. And Leviathan survives, Leviathan or the Tanin, which is crocodile or dragon, and look at Book of Abraham. That's a fun connection there. But anyway, there's one tradition in the Zohar where he's radiates light and carves light into the sun, which then people are able to use and find gold.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and there's a whole tradition in the Zohar about this, the ancients in the mountains of the east using rites of the sun at dawn with that light radiating, the first light, to be able to find where the gold is, which is considered idolatrous, not because it's false, but because they're taking part of the worship and distorting it, so they're focusing only on that.
But that also ties into the story of Joseph Smith too, where he's able to find gold, which is actually the light, because it's scriptures at the same time. Right.
And Joseph is versed in those secular, I mean, we couldn't even call it secular because the people at the time,
right,
there was as much of a spiritual dimension to this as it was for profit or greed. But Joseph takes his talent and his skills and his abilities and uses it according as God directs to find this more spiritual form of gold.
It is so cool the way it all ties together like that.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things we can look at.
You're kind of blowing my mind a little bit with all of this. That is so cool. Okay, I just have one or two more questions for you. But in a book called Seer Stone versus Urim and Thummim, the Book of Mormon on Trial, James and Hannah Stoddard say this, quote, "The Lord works in repeating patterns, and as we can see, his pattern has remained consistent through generations of prophets and throughout time," end quote. They meant that to say that it was a critique of Joseph using seer stones that would have been ordained by God other than the Urim and Thummim. They were saying that it doesn't fit the Lord's patterns. And so it couldn't possibly be true that he was using these other seer stones. So how do you respond to that? Would you agree, or do you think it's actually the opposite? Like it fits the Lord's pattern better than just having just the Urim and Thummim?
I mean, once we accept that the Lord's going to use a glowing stone, right, or a stone that you can look into and see things with, does a number of them make any difference, or where one comes from or not? Mm. It's not the instrument that really matters here. In fact, these are vessels for divine light, right, which is based on Joseph being righteous. Not just anyone can pick. I can guarantee if the church would ever let you pick up that seer stone, it's not going to just work for you.
Right.
Joseph ends up using it because he's more used to it. It's the Urim and Thummim, the interpreter, is there spaced further out for him. It's cumbersome. He doesn't know how to use it. Right, so he does the same thing, but it accomplishes the same purpose. And B.H. Roberts has, in his New Witnesses for God, he has such an amazing description of its spiritual purpose and light. It's not something that bothered him. He didn't see it as a different pattern. And I don't think we should be bothered whether it happens in a book, in a brass mirror, in a stone of whatever shape, size, or color, or provenance. Because some of these traditions we have And we have other figures that, not just biblical ones, that have them. They don't usually care much about where they come from, but it's all about that divine light that comes through them and the purpose that they're used for. Joseph didn't persist in his village seer treasure digging. He turned it to the purpose that God wanted him to use. So if you're going to have a faith crisis, that's not what it should be about, is which glowing stone you used.
Right. No, I completely agree with you on that. Lastly, how would you think that we would be able to tap into that divine light and use that in our lives today?
So not everyone, in fact, very few people are given the ability to see into the future, whether it be by dreams or others. I know people who can, I can't.
Same.
My dreams are always so surrealistic and have nothing to do with anything. But if we don't tap into the seer abilities, we can certainly tap into the goodness. Like the example I shared, what do we do with the light that we discover? We manifest it, we make it, bring it out by what we do. And I do want to share just one last story.
Absolutely.
This is another one that's never been used, but I think it ties nicely into everything here. So the Jews of Persia, Iran, one of the oldest communities, in the 14th century, they were not in a very good condition. There weren't a lot of scriptures. Not a lot of people knew them or followed them. And there was this man named, and he was a Jewish man named Mullah Shaheen. And one night he had this vision where this man comes in and he gives him a box. And he opens it, and inside this box is this bright stone. He puts it on his hand, and then he breaks it open, and the light shines forth. And light shines everywhere, and he decides after the light is given to him so he can help bring people back to the ways of God. So he composes this epic poem in the style of the Shahnameh, which for Persians, they were all crazy about epic poetry. If you were anyone, the Muslims adopted it because it was such a cultural part, even though these were pagan and pre-Muslim things, they adopted it because it was such a part of the culture there. And he wrote this amazing poem that's still read by Persian Jews to this day. And in his introduction to it, he talks about how he was able to bring down a new light into the world also. So we can also use the light of Christ, if we want to be able not only to learn more about the scriptures, but to help bring people closer to God and share that.
Well, I think that was very well said. And thank you so much for coming and sitting down with me today.
Thank you, Sarah.
This was so interesting. I was just fascinated by everything you were saying.
And there's so much more we could have gone into, but this is a good taste. I hope everyone looks into this a bit more.
Yeah, no, so do I. Where would you recommend people look to start looking into some of these stories, especially if they don't read Hebrew or any of those older,
right,
like Greek or any of the old languages?
So really, really good place to start. One is Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews.
Okay.
He's very reliable in what he quotes, but he does jumble everything together because he's given us an overview. If you get it, you can get the old sets. Make sure you have the index at the end.
Okay.
So you can look it up. That tells you a lot more about it. The newer JPS version has footnotes, which is great.
Awesome. Yeah.
Tree of Souls is also helpful because he does have a list of where he has his sources, and he's got a lot of really quite interesting ones. They're good places to start.
Okay.
There's a website, Sefaria, which has a lot of the texts. They're still working on translations for some, but there's plenty you can find.
Okay.
And different places like that. You can follow the bibliography. The Zohar has been translated. The recent translation by Daniel Matt is recommended. Okay. It can be expensive, but you can view some in Google Books and other places. These are good places to start.
Okay.
And I'll be happy if anyone wants to address any questions about where to find sources. I'm happy to help with that.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we can bring you down again to talk about more of these.
It'll be fun. Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, so did I. Thank you so much.
Thank you.